minutes. This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Right, now, coming up over the next 30 minutes, it's what I reckon is an extraordinarily powerful interview because of the guest and his life story and what has happened to him. So maybe you'll sit back, if you're lying in bed, you're sitting in the house, and just imagine your loved ones around you. Imagine your partner and your children and the safety that they have in their home. And then imagine if that all disappeared at the click of a finger. Because many of us take our family for granted. Martin Roberts did. He had a near perfect life with his wife Sasha and his 4-year-old son Lio. And then one day, his life changed forever.
Well, when I first met Sasha, I was a 22-year-old graduate student at the University of Sussex. She was a year older than me. She was working on her PhD, studying early modern literature. She was really bright. She was really sparky, incredibly brilliant and captivating. We met playing a joke match of cricket, which we got trounced at. But I was the bowler and she was the wicket keeper, and it was love at first throw, really.
And that was it then? You fell in love very, very quickly?
We did. There was very little faffing about, really. We knew it right from the word go that we were meant to be together. And we had a really intense and profound early relationship where we spent much of our time courting through letters in a very old-fashioned way. We had email, but we didn't. We preferred to write letters to each other. I was after I finished at Sussex, I was in New York, where I was a lecturer at a university there. She was a lecturer at a university here in Britain, and we exchanged glorious letters and postcards and little gifts in the post for many years.
Did you have your son quickly?
No, we met in 92. We got married in 99, and Leo was born in 2001. So it was about 9 years after we met that we had our son.
And you describe Leo as this little boy. When I was reading the notes, the blonde hair and blue eyes, and thinking about the world and talking about the world constantly when he was young.
Yes, he was an incredibly precocious little boy, and very, very, very beautiful, very much like his mum with blonde hair and blue eyes, and really chirpy and really sparky. And he used to love, still does love languages, and he used to introduce himself when he was 4 years old by saying, "Hello, my name is Leo, and I speak 4 languages," which is something of an exaggeration, but he did speak really, really good 4-year-old English, excellent 4-year-old Italian. We raised him bilingually with a smattering of French and German phrases thrown into the mix.
Life is extraordinary because one twist, one turn, and everything can change. And that's what's happened to you.
Yes, it was a day like any other day, a goodbye like 100 other goodbyes that we'd had. Sasha drove me to the train station in Lewis, where we lived, and she dropped me off to catch my train. I was headed up to the north of England to a conference at the University of Sunderland, and Leo was with her in the car. They were off to her job at the University of Kent, where she was going to unpack her new office, which had just been decorated over the summer, and she was very, very excited about the thought of new shelves and desks and fresh paint and all that. And she dropped me off at the station, and I got out of the car, and something just didn't feel right. Something made me go back in the car. So I opened the door again. I got back in the car, and I put my hand on Leo's cheek, and I said, "Leo, remember, I'll always be with you."
And this is really, really, for what we're about to hear, extraordinary. And it's a little incident compared to what is to happen, which we will hear. But it's extraordinary that something was in your gut to tell you that something was wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What did it feel like?
It felt completely otherworldly and uncanny. I felt light. I felt like I was floating. I felt like I could look down on the scene as it was unfolding with me in it, as if I was a character in it. And when I got back in the car to say goodbye to Lio for a second time, it even felt over the top to myself as I was doing it. I'd said goodbye to him dozens of times before at train stations and airports as I was going off to pursue this or that speaking engagement or research project or whatever. And I'd never once thought to make such a big ceremony of our parting. So I went back in the car. I told him that I would always be with him, and he blows me a noisy kiss, and I get out of the car again, and Sasha comes around and gives me a hug, and I remember her body just feeling very cold, unusually cold given the late summer morning that we had, and she says something very odd to me as well. She says, "Don't let these pessimistic Brits get you down," which is completely bizarre because I'd often thought of myself as one of the slightly pessimistic ones, someone good at managing expectations, good at criticizing foolishness where I found it, and someone who was kind of slightly cynical and slightly proud of being cynical. But she gets back in the car after she kisses me goodbye, and I still have this weird sensation of butterflies in my gut and a very light head. And she drives off up the hill. She drives off up Station Street in front of the station in Lewis. And I remember thinking, I've got to do something to get them to turn around. I've got to do something to get them to stay with me or to come up to Sunderland with me.
My God.
I just knew something was wrong. And because I was a rational person, I just shelved those feelings. I pushed them aside, and I thought, right, just go into the station, get your ticket, and be off. Which is what I did. So I pushed those feelings down, and I walked into the station.
And then, what was to be a few hours later, the police came to you.
Yes. I was up preparing for the lecture that I was going to give, a keynote address at this big conference, and two police tracked me down in my hotel room. And I know something is wrong immediately because they lacked that usual swagger that I'm used to seeing in constables, and they lacked that kind of that certainty and that sureness, and they wouldn't look me in the eye. So I knew something was wrong. They just didn't seem, they weren't behaving like I'm used to seeing policemen behave.
And now the horrible moment that every husband, every father thinks is stuff of nightmares.
Yes, they told me that there had been a crash on the M2 in Kent, and that Sasha had been killed, and that Lio was very near death in King's College Hospital. And I raced to the airport, flew down to Heathrow. More police escorted me to King's College Hospital, where
Can you remember walking into that hospital?
I can. I can remember. This motorcycle cop who met me at the door. I was dropped off by two of his colleagues, and he raced me to the lift, and we bashed on the button to make the lift come, and the lift wasn't coming, and the seconds creeped by. It felt like hours we were waiting for that lift, and finally I just found the stairs, and we bolted up the stairs, and I ran into pediatric intensive care. And it was incredibly dark in there, much darker than I thought it should have been. And
your lovely son, your 4-year-old son, remember how you described him? His head full of blonde hair, yes, blue eyes, full of vitality.
Yes.
What was he now?
He was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Hair mostly shaved off, the rest matted with blood. Fractured skull, severe brain damage, horribly mutilated and shattered left leg, surrounded by a halo of computer screens, underneath an air blanket that was rising and falling, trying to regulate his temperature, because the part of his brain that regulated his body temperature had been damaged. And
I know what intensive care is like. It's full of not just machines and wires, but full of that sound of a machine beeping, and the relevance of those beeps is the difference between life and death, and how close your loved one is between life and death.
Absolutely, yeah. You develop an intimate relationship with all that technology in a way that you can't possibly imagine.
You get to crunch the numbers every day, don't you?
You watch and you hope and you pray over decimal points on computer readouts, because if the intracranial pressure gets too much, or if the blood flow to the brain gets too little for too long, your son is dead. And it is an incredibly otherworldly experience where you kind of are so dependent on this technology, and this technology becomes almost a part of your child while they're in that situation. And
you're struggling with two realities at this stage. Your son is clinging on to life, and your wife is dead.
Yes, yeah.
Now, how does your brain cope with both at the same time?
Well, on the one hand, it was incredibly hard, because Sasha in life had always been there to support me, to encourage me, to hold my hand, and to tell me everything was going to work out all right. And to not have that support in that moment when I needed it most profoundly was absolutely excruciating. I was at a loss, but very fortunately, Lio filled that gap. I was told by the doctors a couple of hours after I arrived in intensive care to prepare for my son dying.
This is the doctor who you describe in your book as Dr. Doom.
Yes, this is Dr. Doom.
Tell me about Dr. Doom, your first meeting with her.
When I first met Dr. Doom, it was about 2 hours after I'd come into pediatric intensive care, and I had met the nurses and the paramedics and other people who were looking after Lio, but this was the first encounter with the proper doctor on call, and she met me at Leo's bedside. She said she wanted to have a word with me out in the little greeting room outside of the ward. So I followed her, not knowing what to expect, afraid of what to expect, just in a kind of complete tumult of all kinds of emotions of loss and fear and hope. And she told me that I should prepare for Lio dying. She said that it was very likely that Lio would not live to the next morning. And
does she say it as brutally as that? Do they caveat it with any type of nice language, or what do they say?
No. It is in my experience, in that experience, it was brutally direct. And throughout all of this, I found often some of the doctors would really lowball the prognoses. She told me to prepare for Lio dying, and she didn't offer anything beyond that. And I said, well, okay, I tried to compose myself, and I said, okay, what if everything works out as best as you could imagine it working out? What if, his recovery is completely astounding? Give me your best case scenario. And she said, well, best case that you should allow yourself to hope for is that perhaps one day, maybe, he might be able to attend a school for the severely mentally disabled. And this was devastating. I was an academic. My wife was an academic. We were people who lived by our minds. And to have our bright and sparky and precocious and intellectually curious little 4-year-old reduced to this prognosis of maybe, possibly one day attending a school for the severely mentally disabled and needing lifelong care because of cognitive shortcomings was like a physical beating for me. I remember being devastated by it.
A horrible question from me now. At that point, when you get that prognosis, would you have rathered he was dead than severely disabled for the rest of his life?
No.
So you were fighting for him to keep going?
Well, first of all, I didn't accept that prognosis. From the word go, I fought to tune it out. I thought, okay, well, let's take the best case scenario and let's think about that doctor's first case scenario. That means that I'm not going to expect for him to die. And you know what? The next morning, he was still with us. He didn't die. He beat her prediction on that first day. And I latched onto that with my teeth and with my nails. I held onto the simple fact that Lio was still alive, that he didn't die when I was told that he was probably going to die and that I should prepare for him going to die.
And meanwhile, while your son is fighting for his life, while your wife is being prepared to be buried, the person who had caused this to happen was a long-distance lorry driver who had been arrested, and he hadn't taken the necessary breaks, and he was sitting in a police station, and subsequently he would be prosecuted and he would do a couple of years jail.
Yes, he was sentenced to 2.5 years for causing death by dangerous driving. He served, in the end, less than 6 months of that sentence, and then he was repatriated back to Belgium, where he disappeared. And in the book, I include a letter that I wrote to him. I think about him and I think about what he's going through. Him in prison must be feeling the loss of his family in the same way that I was feeling the loss of my family. I was feeling the loss of Sasha and wondering about Leo's future and whether I would be losing a part of Lio in his future. And he was a father too. He had 2 children, and I couldn't help but identify with him somehow. He didn't mean to do it. He didn't intend to harm anyone. He didn't drive into the back of Lio and Sasha because he thought it might be interesting or he thought he might gain something by it. It was an accident. He didn't intend to do it. And,
did he write back to you?
Well, the thing is that just before I finish the letter, he's released from prison and he disappears. And the police liaison that I was working with at the time said, well, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. You know, he's been repatriated back to Belgium. He's off the system. If he ever comes back to Britain, he'll have to register with the probation services. But there's no way of contacting him. So I'm left with this letter that never gets sent. And in some way, while it's much less important for me now, and while there's much less urgency about it now, I'd like to think that maybe the book might find its way to him and he might see this letter, because it's an open-hearted and genuine letter where I'm not angry. I have no interest in retribution. I want to close a chapter of my life with him.
And Martin, back then to your son in hospital, severely brain damaged. The prognosis is that he would be severely brain damaged, his leg smashed, and somehow he beat those odds.
Yes, yeah. It was his story is authentically remarkable. One of the reasons for writing the book is his main neurologist found a blog that I had been keeping to keep my family and friends updated on Leo's progress. I started writing it a few weeks after Lio was in hospital.
He had tears in his brain, right?
Yes, yeah. He had tears between the gray matter and the white matter in his brain. He had what's called diffuse axonal injury, which is lots of breaks in the brain tissue. He had bleeding at several parts in the brain. He had damage to the frontal lobes, the left temporal lobe, the right parietal lobe, the hippocampus, the thalamus. Lots of very particular structures in the brain. And one of the things I did, and I kind of regret doing this now, was very early on, me being an academic, being someone who lived by the book. I couldn't resist going to the medical textbooks when he was in hospital and trying to put together the damage I was reading about on his medical reports with the implications for that damage in the official pediatric neurological textbooks and literature. And I came up with a horrific list of dire inevitabilities and things that the books told me were inescapable based on the nature of his injuries. And instead, I wish I had read books about brain development, about pediatric brain growth, about neuroplasticity, which is a new frontier of neuroscience. And we're at a very interesting point in the way we think about the brain. The kind of old school, the old orthodoxy really thinks about the brain as something with very compartmentalized functions, and once those chambers are broken or damaged, the limitations are inescapable. Now, however, we are starting to understand that the brain is a much more complicated organism than that, and it is plastic. It can reshape itself, restructure itself, heal itself, create new pathways to do things that the old broken pathways can no longer do.
And is that what happened to your son?
That's the best explanation that anyone comes up with. The doctors remain stupefied as to how Lio went from being probably dead and likely, if not dead, then a vegetable for the rest of his life, to being a completely healthy and happy and normal 10-year-old, which he is now.
He's completely healthy now.
Stephen, to look at him now, you would not know anything has happened to him. Stephen, to look at him now, you would not know that anything has happened to him. On the playground, he has loads of friends. He plays with all of the kids in the school. He runs around on two good legs. He does great at maths. Before Easter, his class does a maths times table challenge online game, and he was so proud of the score that he got before Easter on this game, because his score was higher than the score of his head teachers at the school. And I'm not gonna sit here and say there are no issues, that there are no challenges before us. We have a lot of therapy ahead of us. We have a lot of surgery ahead of us. But these are challenges that we will face, and I don't believe that there is anything that Lio won't be able to do in the future.
Let me ask you a really important question, because it's clear throughout this interview that the bond that has developed between you, Dad, and your son strengthened during this process. It's really, really clear. Now, is that true? I've got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely true.
How do you sit down? How does any dad sit down and tell his son that his mum's dead?
Well, that is brutally hard. There's no way to do it, really.
How did you do it?
Well, I put it off and put it off and put it off, and I wish I'd been able to put it off even farther. As Lio was coming out of a coma, the end of a coma is not like we see it on TV. It's not like a light switch going on and you go from being unconscious to bouncing out of bed and skipping down the corridor. It's a very, very slow and gradual process that takes weeks. And as Lio was gradually becoming more conscious and gradually regaining the ability to speak and the ability to understand, he kept more insistently asking about his mother. And I was trying to insulate him from a psychological and emotional blow equivalent to the physical blow that he had experienced in the crash. I didn't think he was ready to understand the fact that his mother had died. I didn't think he was ready to process the information that his mother had died. So I was putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And at the beginning, the hospital staff were great, and they really worked hard to try and accommodate this approach. But it was getting harder and harder for them to keep their stories straight about where Lio's mother was. I was telling him that she was in another hospital, and that she wasn't doing as well as he was, and that he couldn't see her, and that she couldn't see anyone. And eventually, I couldn't put telling him about his mom off any longer, and I booked us a little room in the psychiatric ward at King's College Hospital.
How old was he, Martin?
He was 4 years and 10 months.
My goodness. So you sit him down in this little room.
Yeah. Well, he was in a wheelchair. I was holding him on my lap. He had an external fixator on his leg, holding his leg together, which was mending, with metal prongs sticking up out through his leg, poking him and poking me. I told him that I had something very important to tell him about his mum, and I told him that his mum had died, and that she wasn't with us anymore. And he didn't understand it. He didn't take it in. He couldn't process it as I had thought. And I thought, well, what do I do? Do I back up? Do I put it off more? And then I thought, no, we're here. We've just got to make this work. So I tell him again that his mum has passed away, and he still doesn't get it. And I repeat, and he finally freezes and just starts to cry and to cry, and he cries for what feels like 20 minutes. And then we're playing with this little dollhouse with toys in this little room on the psychiatric ward with little dolls, and he starts to get hysterically silly, and he starts to laugh wildly, and it was just a kind of a brutal moment for all of us. And his brain was struggling to heal itself at that moment, and to just kind of be a normal functioning 4-year-old brain.
And the words that came out of your son's mouth about you were horrible.
He said that he wished that he could change places with me and Sasha, that he wished that I was dead and that his mum was still alive. And I told him honestly, and I felt it honestly, that if I could change places with her, I would. She was such an incredible woman. She was such an incredible mother. I thought her role in his life was more important than my role in his life. And I told him point blank that I would if I could. And he finally settled, and he finally relaxed.
But what you have done, Martin, with the rest of your life and the rest of bringing up your son, is you have been the most incredible dad for your son, and you know that.
Well, thank you, Stephen.
But it's clear, and you do know that, because you say in the book that the life that you had when everything was conventionally good
Yeah.
You had a job, you had everything else.
Yeah.
But you weren't as happy, and the bond that you have with your son now is astonishing.
Yes, yeah. It is truly astounding. When I found out about the crash, I was a 38-year-old senior lecturer at a prestigious university. I had work published in all the major journals in my field. I had work archived in museums. I had my own radio work broadcast on stations around the world. I was extremely accomplished. I had a great job. I had a house. I had a car. I had more speaking engagements than I could say yes to. I had a brilliant wife. I had a wonderful son. I had everything. But I was discontented so much of the time. I was unhappy so much of the time because there was always another line to add to my CV. There was always another project to say yes to. And I didn't see and appreciate the small, beautiful things that I had in my life all around me every day. And now, after the crash, and after going over all of this and putting it into a book, which really helped me understand what's important, I realize what's important. I realize what I'm meant to be doing. I'm meant to be the best dad possible I can possibly be for my son Leo. And I realize now what is really and truly important in my life, and that's relationships with people, relationships with my son, with my family, with my friends. I know what's important. I have a sense of clarity that I certainly did not have before this happened. It's sad that it took such a tragedy to get me to where I am now, but I am so grateful every day that I am where I am now.
I've just touched on some of what is in the book after the crash. It's an incredible story, and thank you for sharing some of it with us tonight, Martin. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
On digital and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Well, there's quite a lot of reaction coming in to that interview from you. Here's the number: 0500 909 693. The text 85058. The email nolan@bbc.co.uk. The main news story tonight: a bailout of up to €100 billion as the Spanish government struggles to help shore up its struggling banks. The Spanish economy minister insisted today this is not a rescue package. The banking analyst Justin Urquhart-Stewart disagrees.
It is a rescue package to try and keep things going. But of course, as ever, you take a step back from all the conversations you've had tonight. It's actually dealing with the symptoms, not the underlying cause. And the underlying cause is actually how you run the currency.
Miguel Ancho Morado is a financial writer in Spain.
Obviously, we needed this help. We needed the bailout. It's not a good thing. It would be better if we didn't need to ask for this money. But considering that this was the situation, I think we got a good deal.
Plenty more to come in the programme, including a look at all of the Sunday papers with the former Labour Home Secretary Jackie Smith and Mark Littlewood, Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. First, let's get the midnight news. Here's Tom Green.
Thank you, Stephen. Spain will get up to €100 billion in international loans as part of a plan to rescue its financial sector. The exact amount will be decided after the completion of 2 audits of its banks. The IMF and the European Commission have welcomed the move. Our Europe correspondent Matthew Price is in Brussels.
They are trying to say, look, there is enough money there, €100 billion, to protect the Spanish banks, to protect, therefore, the Spanish government, and therefore to try and ease the market pressures on Spain. We'll have to wait and see if it works.
So Spain has become the 4th and by far the biggest country to ask for help from the Eurozone's bailout fund. The loan could be worth up to £80 billion. Our Europe editor Gavin Hewitt says it still leaves some questions unanswered.
Will it calm the crisis in the Spanish banking system? Possibly. Will it prevent Spain itself needing a bailout? Possibly too. Will it also prevent the crisis from spreading to Italy? And that is also a possibly. But it was interesting tonight that both the United States and Germany welcomed this bailout as adding some stability to the crisis.
Here, George Osborne has warned that the crisis in the Eurozone is undermining Britain's economic recovery. The Chancellor's told the Sunday Telegraph that investment in the UK is being held back by uncertainty over the single currency. Around 1,000 people have been forced to leave their homes in Ceredigion and parts of Powys in West Wales because of severe flooding. 4 holiday parks were evacuated with floodwater 5 feet deep in some areas. Beverly Jones lives in Capel Bangor, while several houses have been evacuated.
I was lucky. When these three houses left, they couldn't get back in the house, whereas I stayed in the house. I then got stuck and had to get rescued by three firemen. But these internal doors, they were closed, and the firemen had to then break them open, and a lot of personal belongings, DVDs and things have come out.
Roy Vickers lives in Tallybont. He was told to leave his home.
We've lived here for 43 years and we have never, ever seen this. The worst it's ever been is the Kylan River just wouldn't go under the bridge at the far end. That's all. It's never been over the road.
The Duke of Edinburgh will celebrate his 91st birthday at home with his family later after being discharged from the King Edward VII Hospital in London. Prince Philip had been admitted on Monday with a bladder infection. And research suggests putting a student through university generates more than £200,000 for the economy over the course of their working life. The University and College Union is warning that reducing the number of graduates would affect the UK's ability to compete internationally. Sally Hunt is the union's General Secretary.
What we're looking for is for the government and for employers to urgently invest in equipping the UK workforce with higher skills. And if we don't do that, it's every one of us that will pay. It's clear economics.
That's Sally Hunt from the University and College Union. And here's Andy Barwell with the sport.
And Germany started off their campaign at Euro 2012 with a 1-0 success over Portugal through a Mario Gomez goal. A surprise result in the other Group B match, with Denmark holding on to beat the fancied Netherlands side, also 1-0. England boss Roy Hodgson says he will consider Rio Ferdinand for selection after the European Championship and that the defender's international career isn't over. UEFA have confirmed that they've opened disciplinary proceedings against the Football Union of Russia for the improper conduct of their supporters at Friday's match against the Czech Republic. In rugby union, England, Wales and Ireland all lost their test matches away to teams in the Southern Hemisphere. England scored a last-minute try, but they went down 22 points to 17 away to South Africa. In the rain-affected Edgbaston Test, West Indies closed the third day on 280 for 8 against England. Maria Sharapova was the winner of the women's singles final at the French Open tennis. And Sebastian Vettel is to start the Canadian Formula One Grand Prix from pole position.
Across the UK.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
With Stephen Nolan.
Here's just some of the reaction to the interview that we played to you between 11:30 and 12 tonight. Anna says, Stephen, I feel humbled by the story. Stay strong, Martin, for your son. If you missed the interview, it's an incredible story, really, of a man who left his beautiful wife, his beautiful son off to go off to work. He left them in the car and the police approach him and tell him that his wife had died, car crash, son fighting for his life. And just an incredible story of survival and then of an intimate bond that develops between father and son as that little boy fought to save his own life. On Twitter, Ben Osgood says, what an incredible story. I stuck the Nolan Show on to send me to sleep. I've spent the last 30 minutes glued to the radio. Joe writes and says, Stephen, my wife was knocked down and killed at 50. My daughter and I saw her in the road. We've been married over 30 years, 3 children. The sadness and the violence of her death, the suddenness and the violence of her death is the core of the trauma that has never gone away. I was 52. There's no coming back from there for me, says Joe. A few people asking for the name of the book. It's called After the Crash. 0500 909 693. If you do want to send me some of your comments on Twitter, it comes directly into my iPhone. At Stephen Nolan. On Twitter, StephenNolan.